I've always considered myself a rational person. My life, grounded in the tangible and explainable, left little room for beliefs in the supernatural. This skepticism was challenged the day I moved into an old apartment complex. Drawn by its affordable rent and convenient location, the building, with its worn facade and creaking floors, held a certain charm. A whisper of times long past, the apartment itself was unremarkable, save for its persistent draft and the odd, inexplicable cold spots that I jokingly blamed on shoddy insulation. At night, the building settled with groans and creaks, which I attributed to its age. It wasn't until the peculiar incidents began, items misplaced, shadows flickering in the periphery of my vision, that I started to question the rational explanations I had for everything. Initially, these occurrences were easy to dismiss. A draft could have blown papers from the table. I reasoned, the stress of the move was likely causing me to imagine things. But as days turned into weeks, the events grew harder to ignore. My skepticism faced its first real challenge the night my television turned on by itself, flipping channels rapidly as if controlled by an unseen hand. Despite my unease, I tried to maintain a logical perspective, diving into research about the building's history and speaking with neighbors. Their reluctance to discuss the apartment's past, paired with vague mentions of a tragedy involving a previous tenant, only deepened the mystery. One evening, as I lay in bed, the room chilled to an unnatural cold. The silence was broken by a soft, indistinct whisper that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was then, in the tangible presence of the unexplainable, that my skepticism began to crumble. The first few weeks in the apartment passed with a peculiar, yet manageable, assortment of oddities. It started with the small things, the feeling of being watched from the dark corners of my living room, the soft creaks of the hardwood floors outside my bedroom door when I knew I was alone, and the fleeting shadows that seemed to dance just out of sight. I laughed these off as the quirks of living in an old building, telling myself it was all part of the charm. But charm quickly gave way to unease. One evening, as I settled down with a book, the room temperature plummeted. A cold draft wrapped around me, distinct from the usual chill of the apartment. I searched for a source, checking windows and doors, but found none. The air was still, the night outside silent, and yet the cold persisted, a silent intruder that refused to be ignored. The electronics in my apartment began to behave erratically. My computer would wake from sleep mode without prompting. Documents opened and scrolled as though someone had been reading them. The television switched on in the middle of the night, bathing the room in a flickering, ghostly light. Each incident, on its own, could be explained away, a glitch, a draft, a trick of the light. But together, they wove a tapestry of the unexplainable that I could no longer ignore. It was the photographs that truly shattered my denial. I had taken pictures of the apartment to share with friends and family, hoping to capture the quaint details and the warm, inviting spaces I was beginning to call home. But when I reviewed the photos, I noticed anomalies, orbs of light where no light source existed, and in one chilling image, the vague outline of a figure standing in the hallway, transparent, barely discernible, and entirely absent when I looked with my own eyes. The realization that something truly inexplicable was happening within my apartment was a slow descent into fear. I began to dread the night, the time when the shadows grew long and the whispers seemed loudest. Sleep eluded me, chased away by the fear of what lurked just out of sight. In search of explanations, I turned to the internet, poring over forums and articles on the paranormal. I learned of the history that clung to old buildings like mine, of the energies that could be trapped within walls, of spirits that lingered, bound by tragedy or malice. It was a world I had never believed in, dismissed as fiction and superstition. But now, faced with the inexplicable, I was forced to consider the possibility that I was not alone. My inquiries into the history of the apartment yielded little at first. The building was old, dating back to the early 20th century, but records were sparse. It was only through a chance conversation with an elderly neighbor that I began to uncover the truth. She spoke in hushed tones of the previous tenant, a young woman who had vanished without a trace. The police had investigated, but no answers were found. The woman had simply disappeared, leaving behind a void that the building seemed unable to fill. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, my unease turned to dread. The cold spots, the moving shadows, the whispers, they were all connected to the apartment's tragic past, and it was becoming increasingly clear that whatever had happened here, whatever presence lingered, it was aware of me. One night, as I lay in bed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I could almost make out words. A plea, or perhaps a warning. And then, clear and undeniable, a voice spoke my name. It was a moment of pure terror, the kind that roots you to the spot, that makes your heart race and your breath catch in your throat. There was no denying it any longer. I was not alone in my apartment, and whatever shared it with me was making itself known. The days following my first direct auditory encounter with the unknown were marked by a palpable tension. The apartment no longer felt like a sanctuary. It had become a cage, trapping me with an unseen predator. The playful shadows and unexplained drafts had evolved into manifestations of a haunting that refused to be ignored. My nights were plagued with nightmares. Vivid scenes of being chased through the darkened halls of my apartment by an entity I could never quite see, but always felt looming just behind me. Isolation crept in, insidious and complete. Friends and family, once a phone call away, seemed distant, separated from me by more than just physical distance. Their skepticism, though not malicious, felt like a dismissal of my fear. "You're just stressed," they'd say, or "It's all in your head." But the cold spots, the whispers, the shadows, they were all too real, too consistent to be figments of my imagination. In search of answers, I dove into the history of the apartment with a fervor born of desperation. Local libraries and online archives became my haunts, places where I sought any scrap of information that might shed light on my situation. It was in the dim aisles of the city's historical society that I stumbled upon the first real clue, a series of articles detailing a scandal that had rocked the apartment complex in the early 1900s. A cult, hidden beneath the veneer of a social club, had called my building home. Their practices, shrouded in secrecy, were rumored to involve the occult, though specifics were maddeningly vague. Armed with this knowledge, I approached my investigation with renewed vigor. The pieces began to fit together, forming a picture of a place marked by its past, stained by activities that had invited something dark into its walls. The disappearance of the previous tenant no longer seemed like an isolated incident, but a part of a pattern, a cycle of events tied to the building's history. It was during this period of intense investigation that I experienced the most terrifying encounter yet. It happened on an evening much like any other, with the sun setting early, leaving the apartment bathed in shadows. I was in the kitchen when the temperature dropped, a now familiar precursor to the supernatural. But what followed was anything but familiar. The air thickened, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure, dark and indistinct, standing in the doorway to the living room. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. As it moved, its movement slow and deliberate, towards me. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was paralyzed, trapped by my own fear. The figure stopped just short of the kitchen, its form becoming clearer in the dim light. It was a woman, her features blurred, but her intent unmistakable. She raised a hand, pointing at me with an accusation that needed no words. And then, with a whisper that filled the room, she vanished, leaving me alone with the echo of her presence. The encounter left me shaken, my skepticism completely eroded. It was clear that whatever haunted my apartment was not bound by the rules of the living. Its ability to manifest, to interact with the physical world, was beyond anything I could have imagined, and it had chosen me, for reasons I could not fathom. In the days that followed, my life became a series of rituals designed to protect myself. Salt lines at the doors and windows, symbols of protection drawn in chalk on the walls. Anything that might offer a semblance of safety. But the truth was, I felt anything but safe. The entity, whatever it was, had made its intentions clear. I was not welcome here, and it would not rest until I had gone. But leaving was not an option, driven by a need to understand, to confront this presence on my terms. I prepared for what I knew was coming, a final confrontation with the entity that haunted the shadows of my home. It was a decision born of desperation, a final stand against the darkness that threatened to consume me. In the shadow of my terrifying encounters, the world around me seemed to narrow, focusing solely on the entity that had infiltrated my life. The isolation I felt was not just social, it was existential. The boundary between my reality and the supernatural had not just blurred, it had been obliterated. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, through a conversation with an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who had lived in the building since her youth. She was a solitary figure, one I had often seen but rarely spoken to. Perhaps it was the desperation in my eyes or the rumors that had undoubtedly begun to circulate among the tenants. But she approached me one afternoon as I was returning from another fruitless visit to the local archives. "You're looking for answers," she said, her voice a whisper, as if afraid of being overheard. "But you're looking in the wrong places." Her apartment, filled with the clutter of decades, smelled of old paper and time. But it was her words, more than the setting, that captivated me. She spoke of the building's dark history, not as rumor, but as fact. She had been a young girl when the cult was exposed, remembered the police cars and the whispers of the adults, the darkness they invited and didn't leave with them. She told me, her eyes holding mine, "It's been waiting, biding its time." Her admission was a revelation, a missing piece of the puzzle. She offered no solutions, only confirmation of my fears. But it was enough. It galvanized me, provided a new direction for my quest for answers. If the entity was tied to the cult's activities, then perhaps there was a way to sever that connection, to banish it from my apartment and reclaim my life. My research took on new urgency. I pored over old newspapers, dug into online forums dedicated to the occult, and sought out experts in paranormal phenomena. Each step forward was hard. 1. The world of the supernatural shrouded in secrecy and skepticism. But piece by piece, the picture became clearer. The cult had been involved in something beyond mere rituals. They had been attempting to contact something, to bring it into our world. Armed with this knowledge, I began to plan. The entity, whatever its origins, was bound to the apartment by the actions of the cult. If I could undo that binding, break the connection that tethered it to this place, then perhaps I could drive it out. The preparation was meticulous. I gathered items that my research suggested would be necessary: salt for purification, sage to cleanse, and symbols of protection, drawn from various cultures and belief systems. Each item was a talisman, a piece of the armor I was forging against the darkness. I was not alone in my preparations. Mrs. Thompson, despite her age, insisted on being involved. "I've lived in the shadow of this thing for too long," she said, determination lighting her eyes. "It's time to bring it into the light." Together, we set the stage for the ritual. The apartment was cleansed with sage, each room bathed in its purifying smoke. Salt lines were laid at every entrance, a barrier against the entity's return. And at the heart of the apartment, we drew the symbols of protection, a circle within which we would confront the entity. The night of the ritual was oppressively still, the air charged with anticipation. Mrs. Thompson and I sat within the circle, the items we had gathered arrayed around us. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, a tangible weight that sought to crush us. And then, as we began the ritual, the apartment came alive. Shadows twisted into grotesque shapes, the air filled with the sound of whispers, angry and insistent. But we continued, our voices joining in a chant that was as old as fear itself. The climax of the ritual was a moment of pure chaos. The entity manifested, a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to absorb all light, all warmth. But around us, the symbols of protection glowed with a light that was not of this world, a barrier it could not cross. For a moment, it seemed as though we would be victorious, that the entity would be banished back to the darkness from which it had come. But then, with a scream that echoed through the apartment and into the depths of my soul, it vanished. The aftermath was silence, a stillness so profound it felt like the world had stopped. Mrs. Thompson and I sat in the circle, exhausted but alive. The ritual had worked. The entity was gone, or so we thought. In the days following the ritual, the apartment felt transformed. The oppressive atmosphere that had weighed on every corner of the space lifted, replaced by a sense of peace I hadn't felt since moving in. The shadows that had once danced menacingly in the periphery of my vision were gone. The whispers silenced. For the first time in months, I slept through the night, undisturbed by nightmares or the fear of what lurked in the darkness. Mrs. Thompson and I shared a sense of cautious relief. We had confronted the entity head on and, against all odds, seemed to have emerged victorious. The rituals and symbols, the chants and the sage, had all played their part in banishing the darkness from the apartment. It was a victory. Yes, but one we spoke of in hushed tones, aware that our understanding of the forces we had engaged was limited at best. Life began to return to normal, or as normal as it could under the circumstances. I returned to work, to the routines that had been disrupted by the haunting. Friends and family noticed the change in me, the absence of the tension that had shadowed my every movement, the return of a lightness to my step. I shared the story with a select few, those I knew would understand, or at least not judge. The experience had changed me in ways I was still beginning to understand. I was no longer the skeptic I had once been. How could I be, after facing the unexplainable and emerging on the other side? But peace, as I would soon discover, was a fragile thing. It started with small, almost imperceptible changes, a chill in the air that lingered a little too long, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I told myself it was the residue of the past months, the psychological remnants of the haunting. But deep down, a part of me knew that the battle was not over. The realization came one evening, as I was going through the photographs I had taken before and after the ritual. Among the images of the apartment, now cleansed and serene, was one that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of the living room, taken from the doorway. In the corner, barely visible, was a shadow that should not have been there, a shadow that bore an uncanny resemblance to the entity we had banished. I stared at the photograph, my mind racing. Had we been mistaken in believing we had driven the entity out? Or had our actions, meant to protect, somehow invited something else into the space we had fought so hard to cleanse? The questions multiplied, each more unsettling than the last. I turned to Mrs. Thompson for counsel, but found her as perplexed and troubled as I was. We sealed it out, she said, her voice tinged with doubt. Or at least, we thought we did. That night, as I lay in bed, the whispers returned, faint at first, then growing louder, more insistent. They were different this time. Not the angry, malevolent sounds I had grown accustomed to, but something else. Something new. And amidst the cacophony, one phrase emerged, clear and chilling. You opened the door. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. In our efforts to banish the entity, we had not closed a door but opened one, inviting in forces we did not understand, could not comprehend. The apartment, my sanctuary turned prison, had become a gateway, and we had unwittingly turned the key.